Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Olney Baptist Church Online. We're delighted to have you as part of our online service. I came across this story of a little boy that was saying a prayer to God, and I want to read that prayer to you. He said, "Dear God, please take care of my daddy and my mommy and my sister and my brother and my doggy and me. Oh, please take care of yourself, God. If anything happens to you, we're going to be in a big mess." Well, sometimes we can find ourselves in a big mess, and it's good to know that God is with us no matter what. I remember many years ago my father passed away, and I reached out to a friend, and his dad was a pastor in the ministry, and his dad's actually gone home to be with the Lord too at this point, but I reached out to him, and my friend John encouraged me with just those simple words: God is there. He's there. No matter what you're going through, no matter what loss you're experiencing, no matter what valley you're going through, no matter what, remember, God is there. And we're going to look at a beautiful story in the Old Testament today about a woman who found herself in a big mess, and thankfully, she could call upon the God who was there. We're going to look in 2 Kings chapter 4 in the story of Elisha and the widow. And the title of my message today is Keep On Pouring. Keep on pouring. We pick up the story in 2 Kings chapter 4 and verse number 1. 2 Kings chapter 4 and verse number 1. And we read, "A certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, 'Your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord, and the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slaves.'" There's a lot of speculation as to who this woman's husband might be. Some say it may have been Obadiah the prophet, or Obadiah the servant in King Ahab's court who helped save the lives of prophets. We don't know, but the text seems to indicate pretty strongly that her husband was a faithful servant of Elijah and Elisha. And if you recall in the message that I did a few weeks ago, back when we weren't under quarantine in the church, I preached on Elisha and Elijah, and I talked about the schools of prophets that were basically followers of Elijah and Elisha. And the indications are that her husband was part of one of those schools. That's the phrase, the sons of the prophets. So these were prophets, these were students of Elisha and Elijah. And her son was, her husband rather, was one of those prophets, and was therefore a faithful servant of the Lord. And so she was part of a God-fearing family. And I think that's an important context to know. This is a God-fearing woman, part of a God-fearing family, a family that was loyal to Jehovah. And the context of that day was, if you were to look at the surrounding society and the surrounding lands, many of the people had given themselves over to the worship of false gods and the worship of idols, especially the worship of Baal, or Baal, some will say. And so it was a wicked culture, a wicked society in many respects, but she was faithful. Her family was faithful, and now this misfortune had fallen upon them. We have to understand that sometimes bad things do happen to God's people, that sometimes life is not fair. And she found herself in such a situation. And you ask, well, why isn't life fair? Well, again, there are many reasons why there's pain and suffering in this world. Number one, we just live in a fallen world, and the earth itself is cursed, and the earth is fallen. Number two, we're surrounded by sinners. Number three, we ourselves are sinners. And number four, we are often the victims of supernatural or spiritual forces. And so there's multiple reasons why there's evil in this world, and sometimes that evil befalls us. Jesus says it rains on the just and on the unjust. And so there are going to be times where we face messes, we face difficult times, but we can nevertheless know that God is there. And so this woman reaches out to the man that she respected as a servant of the Lord. She reaches out to Elisha, and she seeks out this godly counsel. So we see, number one, that she has a solid godly foundation, a foundation of faith, that she's a God-fearing woman. And number two, she seeks out godly wisdom and counsel by reaching out to her spiritual leader, Elisha. And so she reminds Elisha that her husband was a faithful servant of his, and that he feared the Lord, and informs him that he is now dead, and now informs him of the situation. And remember, back in those days, they didn't have cell phones and that sort of thing. So, chances are, and they didn't travel by car and things like that. So word traveled slowly. And so Elisha, had probably been a while since Elisha had been able to make the rounds and see and seek out the families of the different students of his and everything. And so he's probably just learning of her husband's death at this point. And so she informs him that her situation, however, is dire. Not only has she lost her husband, and so she's dealing with that grief, but she is about to lose her children because she's in poverty and deeply in debt. Now, in the Mosaic law, it was customary that if a person could not pay, or it was rather allowed, that if a person could not pay their debt, then the creditor could take that person and force them into servitude, or force that person's family into servitude. This, of course, raises questions about the nature of the Old Testament and the law of Moses, and there's all kinds of controversies around that. If you have questions about the Old Testament, I want to recommend this book, and that Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. And it really does make sense. It really explains the Old Testament God, and it really puts a lot of things in perspective. And so I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of that book and read it. It would be very helpful to you. But let me just say that even though the law of Moses allowed for creditors to take people who refused or were unwilling or unable for whatever reason to pay their debt and force them into servitude on a temporary basis, it nevertheless said that creditors were to be merciful to those who were in poverty, to those who were destitute. And that's made clear in the book of Deuteronomy. And so apparently this creditor was violating that and was nevertheless going after this woman in spite of the fact that she was in poverty and dire situation. Creditors weren't supposed to use the law of Moses to harm widows and orphans. And so that's, unfortunately, that kind of corruption happened then, and that kind of corruption happens today, unfortunately. But nevertheless, this woman was in dire straits, and she reaches out to Elisha for help. And then we read in verse number 2, "So Elisha said to her, 'What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?' And she said, 'Your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil.'" Elisha asks a two-part question. The first part of the question is designed to help her process exactly what it is that she's asking for. Sometimes we need to be clear on what it is we need and what it is we want. And oftentimes you'll find that when you go to meet with a counselor or meet with a pastor or meet with your deacon or a trusted friend, they're going to help you work that through and just kind of process, okay, what is it that you feel you need? What is it that you feel you want? And it's important that you kind of establish that and really get to that. So he asks her the first question, and then he goes right into the second question, and he says, "And what is it that you have?" So it's kind of a two-parter there, and anyone with any kind of counseling training can know that there's some good wisdom here, some counselor's wisdom here in this conversation. He asks her, first of all, let's clarify what it is you want, and what do you want from me, personally, and then secondly, what is it that you have? And a lot of times we sell ourselves short, and we think we don't have much. Now this woman responds, "Your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil." And we don't know if there's a pause between her saying nothing in the house and a jar of oil. We don't know the context of that conversation, but just based on the way that she words this, it seems that she is saying, I don't have anything. I've got nothing of value. I got this jar of oil over here, and it's almost like an afterthought. Well, I got this jar of oil, but she doesn't put any stock in that. The oil that she has is no doubt olive oil. Now, the olive oil in that day was used for different purposes. It was used for medicinal purposes. It was used for heating and for lighting. It was used for food and cooking food. It was used for cosmetics. And so there's a variety of uses for it. And so there was value to it, but she had just one jar of oil. And she was in poverty and in debt, and so more than likely she had no way of getting any more jars of oil. And so she knew that once she ran out of that was it. And so she was focused on her lack, on her need, and not focused on what she had. And it's very easy for us to fall into that trap, especially when we've gone through and experienced a loss. When we experience a loss and we start losing things or people in our lives, we start to have that loss mindset and that scarcity mindset, as opposed to being thankful and grateful for what we still have in our life. She starts to sell herself short by saying, I have nothing in the house. And oftentimes we look at our own lives and say, we have nothing. But it's important that we do an honest inventory, an honest and thorough inventory of what we do have. When we face catastrophe in our life, when we face a big mess in our life, it's important to remember that we've got God with us, number one. And number two, it's important to remember that God has already blessed us with many things. You know, right now, if you're able to watch and listen to this broadcast, then that means that you have the ability to see and the ability to hear. Many people don't have those things. God woke you up this morning. You have life again for another day. Many people did not wake up this morning. You have family and friends, no doubt. You have loved ones. You have the ability. You have a roof over your head. You have many things in your life, and many times we take the things that we have in our life for granted. But God can take the things that you have in your life, however little or insignificant you feel that they may be. He can take those things and do mighty works through them. He can take those things and do wondrous miracles through them. And so this is a lesson that she is about to learn here. So she says, I have nothing but a jar of oil. Then he said, go borrow vessels from everywhere, from all your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few. I find it interesting that he tells her to go borrow more things and she's already in debt. Just a little side note. And then he says, and when you come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons, then pour it into all those vessels and set aside the full ones. Now, we will get back to the instructions on shutting the door. We'll get back to that. First, I want to focus on the fact that he tells her to go and get as many vessels as you possibly can, many empty vessels. Borrow as many as you can get. You know, don't stop. Get as many as you can and bring them in. And then what you're going to do is you're going to shut the door behind you and your sons, and you are going to then take that jar of oil, that one jar of oil, and you're going to pour it into all those empty vessels. Now, this, you know, we know what happened. We know how the story turns out, but she didn't know that at the time. At the time, she's like, you know, she's got to be thinking, you want me to do what? I got one jar of oil. You want me to do what? You know, that's how a lot of us would think. Sometimes when God shows up with an answer, it's not the answer that we expect, or he's, you know, we get this indication that God's going to do something, and it's like, really, seriously, that you're going to do that? You know, there's a lot of times where God has instructed people in His Word, and even today, told people to do things that don't make any sense. And oftentimes, if we're not careful, we can start arguing with God and debating God on what it is we're supposed to do. But to this woman's credit, she doesn't argue with God. She doesn't argue with Elisha. She just does it, and that is to her credit. So he tells her to go out, and note the command here has an implication of faith, a component of faith here to it, because if she didn't believe that God would provide, then she wouldn't have borrowed that many vessels. But the extent of the number of vessels that she borrows is tied to the faith that she has in God's provision. And so she's told to go out and get as many vessels as possible and to bring them in, and then to shut herself in with her sons. And so then we pick up in verse number 5. So she went from him and shut the door behind her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured it out. She poured it out. Now I want to key on the fact that she shut the door behind her and her sons. I want to say that quite often it's necessary for us to take time to shut the door. Now, it may be that I'm reading too much into this, but I don't think so, because I know what the Apostle Paul said. In Romans 15, in verse number 4, Paul writes, for whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. In other words, Paul is saying that all those stories of the Bible and all the teachings of the Word of God are there for our benefit. And a lot of times God structured miracles a certain way in Bible times, particularly those miracles that are recorded in Scripture. He structured them a certain way to be object lessons, not only for the people involved in those miracles, but for us today. And this miracle is not only a great miracle for her, but remember, everything that we do and everything that God does ultimately is for His glory. And so this miracle has ramifications that have extended down for now thousands of years. This is an object lesson for us today in the 21st century, just as it was a lesson for her and her children. And so she does this. She goes and shuts the door with her sons. And oftentimes, I believe, God does not come through for us in the way that we want Him to and in the timetable that we want Him to, because we don't shut the door. Now, note what happens when she went out and engaged all of her neighbors and talked to everyone and brought all these borrowed vessels in. She gathers everything in. She goes into a private area of her home. She closes the door. Now, what she does is she closes the door to the outside world. So she shuts the door to the outside world, and now it's just her, her sons, and God. The people that are in this mess, the people that are in the middle of the situation is her and her family. And so at this time, it's time to shut the door to the outside world, shut the door to all distractions, and let's get alone, me, my children, and God. You know, a lot of times God doesn't show up because we don't shut the door. You know, when I read this passage, I look at Jesus' teachings on the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus said sometimes we got to just get into our private prayer closet. You know, when was the last time you got alone with God? And how often do you get alone with God? And when we're looking for God to have a breakthrough for us, you know, when we're looking for God to lead us through one of those breakthrough moments, it's important that we take time to shut the door. To shut the door. And if honestly, here's the truth. If we're too busy for God, then we're too busy. If we're too busy to spend time with God, then we're too busy. And so she takes the time now to shut the door, and it's just her and God and her kids. And so then she begins to pour out the oil. So now she takes that which God has blessed her with. She takes that which she has, and she pours it out before him. And God shows up and does a mighty miracle for her. Now it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not another vessel." So the oil ceased. You know what I find interesting? We don't know how many vessels that they had gathered. We're not told that number. But let's say that they gathered 50 vessels. And so she fills 50 vessels, and then the oil stops. But imagine if they would have gathered 500 vessels. If they would have gathered 500 vessels, then the oil would have continued until all 500 of those vessels were full. You know, sometimes the miracles that God does in our lives are tied to the extent of our faith and our obedience. Oftentimes, we limit God in what God does for us because of our lack of faith or our lack of obedience. Now, this does not mean, I don't want to be misunderstood here. God's all-powerful, and God doesn't need us, and God's not limited by us. I don't mean that. But God chooses, oftentimes to work through us according to our faith and our obedience. And many times, we deny ourselves the power and blessings of God because we're not obedient to what he has told us to do, and we're not faithful to what he has told us to do. I just think of just a simple example here. Many times, people go through life and they feel like God's not showing up with answers. They have questions, they have problems, and they're not getting any answers. And one of the first questions that I will ask you, if you ever come to me with that complaint, one of the first questions I'm going to ask you is, how often do you pray? How often do you read the Bible? How often do you go to church? You know, if you are not showing up to listen to God, then why do you expect God to show up to talk? I don't, you know, it doesn't quite compute, you know. I mean, you've got to be faithful and obedient with what God has told you to do. And you've got to be faithful with what you have. You know, if God's given you the ability to listen and to hear, then guess what? You have the ability to listen and to hear from him. If God's given you the ability to see, you've got the ability to see his word and read it. If you are not faithful and obedient to what God has told you to do, then don't expect God to show up on your terms and do things your way, even when you're not faithful to him. This woman and her sons were faithful to what God had told them to do through the prophet Elisha. They were obedient. God showed up, and the oil poured out. One of the reasons that we aren't able to pour out our oil for God is because we're not letting God work through us to give us the oil that we need to pour out. You know, God will give you the strength that you need to carry out his plan and purpose for your life, but you have to be obedient and faithful to what God has told you to do. Jesus talks about how he will make those who are faithful in a few things, he will make them lord over many things. You know, you've got to be faithful in what God has already given you. You've got to be obedient with the instructions that God's already given you, and then God will come through for you. So then she, after this miracle has happened, she then, verse 7, goes and tells the man of God. She testifies to the work of the Lord. How many times do we experience God? God answers a prayer. God will do something, and we don't testify of it. We don't say any praises. I mean, we should be. I'm just going to be honest. We should all be. When God answers a prayer, we should be coming to prayer meeting on Wednesday night, back when we're off quarantine, or posting in the OBC Prayer Ministries group or whatever and saying, God showed up. God answered this prayer. A lot of times we're great at sharing our needs with God, but we're not too great at testifying to his wondrous works. Think about why God shows up. He shows up because he loves you, but he also shows up because it's to bring glory to him. And we need to be testifying to what God does. Have you thanked God for what he has done already in your life? Have you thanked him for the answered prayers? And have you testified to others about how God has shown up in your life? She does that. She comes and she runs and she finds the man of God. She went to this guy with a prayer request and a need. He gives her instructions. She then comes back and says, God showed up. He did it. And she testifies and she gives a praise report here. And then he gives her further instructions. Now, note, here's another angle on this. Oftentimes, God is not going to give you the entire plan A to Z. This is a great frustration to me personally, because I like to know everything that's laid out. I like to know, okay, has this happened? Has this happened? I like to make sure the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, and I just like to have things laid out and have things all explained, and I like to kind of know the future, and I want to plan ahead, and that's my nature. I just want to plan things out and get it done. But sometimes God doesn't reveal all the plans. Sometimes he just gives just step one, and then we got to obey and do step one. And then we come back after we've done step one, and we can now ask him for step two, and then he'll give us step two, and then we do that, and then step three. But oftentimes we deny ourselves the blessings of God because we stop midway through. We don't follow through, and we don't do the whole thing. We just kind of partly obey, and then maybe do one step or two steps, and then we stop. But this woman, after she fulfilled the first step, she then comes back to the prophet and says, okay, God showed up. He did it. I praise his name. But what now? What do I do now? And I love this woman. I love her faith. I love her heart and her obedience here. And so the man of God answers her, and Elisha says, go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons live on the rest. What's awesome here is that not only has God provided enough for her immediate need and saved her sons from slavery. Let's just be clear. God has come through, performed a great miracle, and now her sons are saved from slavery. And she's now debt-free. And that's an amazing thing. That in and of itself is amazing. Amazing. The love of God. He has taken her out of debt, and he has spared her sons from slavery. But not only that, he now has given her enough, and her sons, enough money to live on for some time after that. He's not only met her need, but he's gone over and above that need. And we serve an amazing God. And I am reminded of a wonderful passage that's found in the book of Ephesians here, in the book of Ephesians 3:20 and 21. Now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be glory in the church by Christ Jesus to all generations forever and ever. Amen. Life really, when you get right down to it, it's simple. We are here to glorify God, and we are here to serve him, and we will continue to serve him as long as we are willing to take what God has given us and pour it out before him. And if we're willing to keep on pouring and keep on serving, God will be there for us, even in our times of need, even in our messes. Don't limit God with your disobedience. Don't limit God with your lack of faith. Or I should say, don't limit the work that God's going to do in your life through your lack of obedience and your lack of faith. God is not limited by your imagination. God is not limited by your limitations. God is limitless. Jesus says that all things are possible. Paul says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. No matter what mess you may find yourself in, no matter what loss you may be experiencing, no matter what grief you may be processing, no matter what circumstance in life you may find yourself, no matter what valley you may be walking through, God is there. And he is a mighty God and an awesome God and a gracious God and a loving God. And he is there for you. Call upon his name, obey him, trust him, do what he says, and he will lead you safely through step by step. Trust him, obey him. You can count on him because he is God, he is awesome, and he will always be there for his people. I hope this has been an encouragement for you. I wish you the very best. God bless you. Have a great rest of the day. Take care.